Hi, my name is Martin Sedgwick, and today I'm going to talk to you about the vital importance of value chains and how organizations are increasingly focusing on these in the context of their broader net zero strategies. We'll start with providing a little bit of context, first of all, about what is sort of net zero and why are value chains so important to that. We'll then start to look at some of the challenges and opportunities that are inherent when it comes to focusing on value chains. We'll provide a kind of high-level approach as to the sorts of actions and initiatives that we're seeing our clients undertake when it comes to focusing on these issues. And then finally, we'll have a couple of case studies of selected examples from some of our clients. So first of all, what is net zero and why are value chains so important to that? In recent years, we've seen more and more governments and states and companies focusing on net zero and making commitments to achieving net zero by 2050, or in many cases sooner, in response to the Paris Agreement that was launched back in 2017. And it's conceptually very, very simple. So in accordance to the latest climate science, we know that to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to achieve a net zero economy by 2050 at the latest. And that means that we need to reduce our emissions as quickly as possible to zero wherever we can. But because of the timeframes available, we just can't achieve that in every single sector, in every single activity. So we therefore need either natural or technical solutions to create those negative emissions in order to have that net zero balance sheet. So conceptually very simple, and more companies we're seeing signing up to this. The graph on the left here is taken from our latest sustainability reporting performance research, where we look at over 200 of the world's largest publicly owned companies. And we can see a real significant increase from 2019 to 2020 in terms of the number of organizations that are making those formal commitments to achieving net zero. If you're going to have a net zero strategy, then for many organizations that also means having science-based targets. That's the targets that will help really sort of drive and deliver those emissions reductions. And again, we can see over 1,000 companies have now formally committed to having science-based targets. And you can see a real increase there in terms of the number of companies signing up, sort of notably since 2017. And if you're going to have science-based targets, that means that you have to look at scope 3. So all of these things are mutually supportive and mutually complementary towards one another. Although looking at scope 3 emissions, looking at value chain emissions has been around for a while, so many organizations have reported on some of the easier to get value chain emissions, such as business travel or the paper or the water and waste and so on that they're using within their operations. So that's been around for a while. So we see a fairly high percentage of the number of companies that are reporting on at least some scope 3. But what we're starting to see is companies look in more and more detail at their scope 3, and indeed starting to build in targets around scope 3 emissions reductions in order to achieve those science-based targets and net zero commitments. So this sort of, again, taken from our latest research, shows that over 25% of the FTSE 100 are now reporting on 6 or more of the 15 scope 3 categories. That's the upstream and downstream emissions according to the GHG protocol. So over 25% are disclosing on 6 or more categories. That means that they're looking at some of those harder to reach sources of emissions, such as purchased goods and services more broadly, investment portfolios, the use of sold products, the upstream and downstream transportation involved in those products and so on. So it's starting to really engage with value chains more extensively and starting to disclose more fully on the true impacts of an organization. Only 14% or 14 of the FTSE 100 are looking at all 15 categories. So there's still a way to go, but certainly a real increase in terms of that focus. And again, that's something that we fully expect to see in future years. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and opportunities now inherent with a focus on value chain issues. And whilst every business is different, for some it will be more around the supply chain, for some it will be more around the investment portfolio, for some maybe more around the use of products and so on. So every organisation is different, but what's common across the board is just the level of impact that value chain emissions have on the overall picture. So for many organisations, it's their Scope 3 emissions, their value chain emissions that account for up to 80% or even more of their total emissions impact. So that makes them the sort of the single most important area of emissions to focus on. But because they lie outside the direct control of the organization, they're also arguably the hardest source of emissions to influence. So, regardless of the sector, it's these twin challenges of impact and influence that make value chain emissions such a challenging area to tackle. So we've identified again some of the sort of common challenges and opportunities that different organizations will face. So again, it will vary depending on the nature of their business. But I think one thing in common on the challenges side is that organizations haven't had to report on the impact. They haven't had to manage the impact, the climate impacts of their value chains historically. So that means a lot of the systems and the processes and so on just aren't really geared up for kind of capturing and acting on this sort of data. And of course, if we're talking about large multinational organizations, then we can be talking about very sort of complex value chains and very complex supply chains. So, multi-billion-dollar supply chains with different parts of the business, thousands of suppliers around the world, very diverse and complex in terms of the wide variety of products and services and so on that are being sourced. So, these can be really, really challenging to sort of get the information in order to to understand those climate impacts. And of course, different sort of competing priorities in there as well. So the people that are responsible for these parts of a business, haven't historically been incentivized to to look at the climate performance or to improve the climate performance. And it's a very evolving area as well. So, there's no standard set view of what best practice looks like yet. It's only relatively recently that organizations have really started to grapple with some of these challenges. So value chain can be a really complex area and challenging area to engage with. But there's some real opportunities in there as well. Again, it was interesting to hear the likes of BT talking at our sustainability reporting performance event on how they've really started to derive benefits from focusing on their supply chains and engaging with their suppliers. So companies can develop real reputational benefits for the narrative around how they're focused on their value chain, whether that's to investors, to employees or other sort of key customers and so on. So some clear benefits from the level of focus that can be communicated. Also, of course, in response to COVID, we've seen a lot of disruption to value chains and supply chains, and so that sort of ability to tackle and manage the systemic risk that's in there, climate change being a key systemic risk that organisations face over the coming years. So by looking at your value chain with a renewed perspective, you can really start to sort of build resilience and start to mitigate against some of those risks. Around collaboration and engagement, we're starting to see some really interesting opportunities there. Companies having sort of Dragon's Den type forums where suppliers can come and sort of pitch new ideas, new products. You're really building that sort of innovation of how things can be done differently to reduce the climate impacts. And sort of through all of this, obviously no one organization can tackle climate change by itself. So it's through this collaboration, it's through this kind of engagement that companies are really able to build sort of stickier and stronger relationships with their suppliers and with other third parties. And ultimately around sort of performance management, but by starting to look at it from the climate lens, from the climate perspective, to really sort of drive and deliver that improved emissions performance. And particularly in the context of a net zero strategy, if you're ultimately going to be having to sort of offset and sequester some of those residual emissions, then it's obviously in your interest to try and drive down those emissions as far as possible first and foremost, and then sort of reduce the amount that needs to be then sequestered at the end. So number of key challenges, number of key opportunities, and of course every organisation is different, but certainly some interesting examples of how companies are responding to these. So let's talk now about a high level approach as to how you might tackle your value chain emissions. And at EcoAct, we very much talk about the from A to zero journey. Every company will have a different sort of starting point, and there's a number of sort of key steps, a number of key activities that organizations need to go through. So whether that's around the sort of planning and the forecasting, what does the strategy look like? Where is the business going? What does that sort of framework for action need to look like? So it's that sort of upfront analysis to sort of help define that direction. through to the sort of the systems for measuring and managing the data, having the targets in place and sort of being able to report against those. So all of that is very much there. And then we have the delivering the real world change piece. So every organization will be different, but there's lots of initiatives that organizations can focus on to start to improve that real world performance. We would typically see sort of value chain as an initiative in that space. So generally speaking, it's a more advanced sort of initiative. It's something that organizations start to look at once they've got a clearer view of their kind of climate impacts and their broader strategy. So definitely a more sort of advanced initiative. But again, a lot of these principles around sort of analysis, data, strategy, looking at the opportunities and so on, they very much apply when it comes to focusing on value chains. And then finally, around the sort of the offsetting piece at the end, the carbon sequestration. So that's our sort of overall A to zero type journey. A version of this for focusing on value chains, as I say, adheres to many of these sort of key principles. So you have to move from that sort of upfront activities to kind of build and develop that sort of understanding of your value chains, using that as a sort of platform to then help engage with key stakeholders and define that sort of ambition, that overall goals and objectives for where you want to get to, and then through to the actual initiatives to act and to deliver that real world change, that sort of improved performance. So to begin with, we're looking at things like the scope, where we're going to get the data from. You're potentially looking at things like benchmarking to see where as an organisation looking at value chain versus some of our key competitors. What sorts of things can we learn from that? There are various choices around the methodology and how you can go about sort of calculating those emissions. So making sure that we've got the right sort of framework there, the right sort of robust methodology for understanding these impacts and how that will evolve over time. And then off the back of all of that, sort of having a real clear view of the materiality assessment. How does the value chain emissions sort of contribute towards the overall picture, alongside the other emission sources? Where are the real risks and opportunities in that? Potentially looking at things like product life cycle assessments to drill into more detail. So then with that information in place, you're then better positioned to sort of talk to key stakeholders to look at things like what the strategy should be, what the target should be, what's going to be right for the broader commercial objectives of the organization. And then with that, you're then into the sort of the roadmap for action. How much of this change needs to be with suppliers versus delivered internally, or looking at sort of your engagement with your investment portfolio or other downstream sources of impact. So you're developing that sort of more detailed plan, roadmap for action. And then finally, around the sort of the ongoing performance management. So the key performance indicators, and you're looking at the systems that you need to have in place to not only sort of measure and manage this, but ensure you're delivering that continued improved performance. So then, to close, a couple of examples, a couple of case studies from some of our clients. So, one would be sort of innocent drinks, where their starting point was very much focusing on the products, looking at the life cycle assessments for 5 of their top purchase fruit, and then using that to sort of extrapolate and form a view of their overall impact across all of the other fruits that they're purchasing. Looking at what some of the key hotspots were, where they could potentially make changes to reduce the risk and the vulnerability within that. So, and then off the back of that sort of understanding built from the product standpoint, you're really then using that to support their targets and support their supplier engagement program. You're looking at ways that they could innovate and collaborate with suppliers and ultimately deliver sort of new, more sustainable practices and new market opportunities. So a very interesting example in there of taking the sort of products and life cycle assessment as a starting point for that kind of value chain engagement. And then a second example would be someone like Telefonica, very different client, very different sort of business. They had their ambitious aligned 1.5 degree aligned scope 3 emissions reductions targets, and they partnered with EcoAct to launch a sort of an engagement program with some of their key suppliers. So different clients with different suppliers with different levels of maturity, different sort of levels of sophistication in terms of their climate change management, and of course different levels of strategic importance for Telefonica as well. But through a combination of supplier interviews, producing sort of training materials and so on, and having various workshops to sort of inspire suppliers to take action, to sort of create that forum to sort of foster and promote innovation and the exchange of best practice. So that sort of ecosystem of collaboration really to help not only Telefonica, but of course the suppliers themselves. So they've started setting their own targets, and through this program of activity, supporting Telefonica with the achievement of a validated science-based target. So a couple of very different examples there, one taking sort of products as the starting point, the other taking suppliers and supplier engagement as the starting point. So as I say, every organization is different, but it's great to see more and more organizations focusing on net zero and focusing on value chains as a key lever to deliver that strategy. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time. I think we'll now have some time for questions and answers, but thank you for listening.